Good morning. I'm Rabbi Alex Lazarus Klein from Congregation Shir Shalom in Williamsville, New York, and I welcome you to Crossroads. Crossroads is a joint production of Town Square Media and the Network of Religious Communities. The Network of Religious Communities is an organization of denominations, congregations, and religious organizations located in and serving Western New York. We are Baha'i, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Unitarian. Together, celebrate the wonderful religious diversity of Western New York. On Crossroads, we discuss the life journey and community service of our guests. And today, I have with me Mike Steklof, the brand new Director of Teen Engagement and Inclusion at the Center for Jewish Engagement and Learning at the Jewish Federation of Western New York.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's a handful because your position is within one agency that's in another agency.
Yes, so the organization I guess I technically work for is the Center for Jewish Engagement and Learning. So tons of words there.
Mm-hmm. And that's brand new too. So I said you're brand new because you literally are. I think you just got off the boat at Ellis Island just a couple of months ago. No, you just arrived in Buffalo.
Yes, so I moved to Buffalo about a month ago from Cleveland, but I originally grew up in Rochester, New York, so I'm definitely from the area.
Right, we were talking right now as the Jewish High Holy Days, and we just had Rosh Hashanah, and this is going to be airing right after Yom Kippur, and then we'll have Sukkot, and your parents are ecstatic because you can go home for the holidays.
They really love it. I was joking with them that I'm about 2 phone calls away from Rochester. It was when I drove home for Rosh Hashanah, I was on the phone with 2 people, and then I was magically in Rochester.
Yeah, right. That's my favorite thing about traveling to Rochester. You can get a lot of phone calls. So since you're from Rochester, and I'm not originally from Buffalo, I'm from Philadelphia actually, but I've lived here quite a while, I never really understood the dynamics between Rochester and Buffalo. And now you're here, so you can help explain because now you'll have lived in both. What do you notice the differences, similarities?
So they're definitely different communities. Having lived in the Midwest for a lot of my life, I actually lived in Louisville, Kentucky before living in Cleveland. Buffalo, to me at least, seems like a much more Midwestern city, where Rochester, I also lived in Albany, so I think Rochester is more similar to Albany, New York in terms of culture, more getting closer to the New York City vibe without being like New York City. I think also in terms of the Jewish community, the Rochester Jewish community is about double the size of Buffalo. So
they claim.
So they claim, according to demographic studies, at least.
No, but see, we had better demographic studies done than they had.
Oh, good to
know.
No,
it's about 6,000 more in the last demographic study.
Okay.
So that's interesting that you say that Rochester's a little bit closer to New York, and so it has kind of that New York vibe. I always thought it was sort of because of the different ethnic cultures that were part of the city, and there were actually distinctions. This was kind of Polish and Italian city, and I think Rochester, where are they from?
I know there's a lot of people from Russia that live in Rochester.
So it's just kind of different cultures. You know, we think of a city as an independent organization, but if you really go think about it, there's so many different cultures that arrive. If you really study a city thoroughly, then you really understand some of the dynamics that come later.
That's really interesting to think about, but it makes sense that all the people that came from countries and people they descended from really make up the makeup of a city.
Yeah. So we're actually here to talk about you. So you're doing something very unusual. You're actually working with teens. You're brave enough to work with teens. So why? What draws you to working with teens?
So I've actually been lucky enough to work really my entire career with teens. And back when I was a teen, I was very active in the Jewish community and Jewish youth group, and that really has given me a lot of inspiration throughout my life. And I always say that a lot of the skills I learned as a teen, I've really carried on to my professional life. And I've just had so many mentors when I was a teen that I really wanted to give that back to teens when I was an adult.
So stop there for one second. So that is so interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot, that, you know, often the things that really got to us when we were growing up in particular, those are the things that we emulate and then we try to replicate. That's a hard thing to do. But so you had these incredible youth group experiences, and then that kind of inspired you to become a youth group leader.
Definitely, yeah. I really remember even starting, I think it was in third grade, going to events with youth in my temple and with youth group advisors, and it just really motivated me and gave me so much to my life. And it's something that I really think about as I'm working with teens and youth, that I want to be that positive role model in the same way that I had positive role models when growing up.
Mm-hmm. I think about that a lot. I've often think about our lives more as with continuity, that we often have our childhood over there and adulthood, but it's all part of the same picture. What we were influenced as a child, it still stays with us so many years later. So in the Jewish world, just for those of you that aren't familiar, we have a number of different big youth groups. Most of them are through the denominations. This is one of the few things the denominations actually do, like NCSY or USY or other such things. So were you in USY?
So I was actually in NIFTY, which is the
okay.
Reform Jewish Youth Group, but I've had the pleasure of working for NIFTY, USY, which is the Conservative Jewish Youth Group, as well as BBYO, which is the more pluralistic Jewish youth group in my career. So I've kind of been all over.
Mm-hmm. And each of them kind of has the same goal of working with kids, but have a little different religious flavor. Is that
Definitely,
kind of
yeah. They all have very similar ideals in terms of teaching teens leadership skills, but they all are through the lens of their particular denomination, or in terms of BBYO, in more of a pluralistic type frame.
And in the Jewish world, that largely means adherence to religious law, I would say. Things like whether you're Shomer Shabbat observant of the Sabbath, not using electricity every Friday and Saturday, or prayer life, or what we call dietary law, kashrut.
Definitely. When I worked for USY and Safon, which is actually the region that Buffalo is in as well, we had very strict rules about what teens could do on Shabbat, whereas in NIFTY, those rules existed in a very different way.
And so you've been working for about a decade on with teens then?
Almost, about 7-8 years.
And, this is a time of complete change. My daughter was born in 2008, and that's basically the time the iPhone was created. And I just think, gosh, this is crazy. My parents were in town for the holidays, and I was telling my kids that when I was growing up, we had maybe I had about 5-6 rolls of film that were taken on me. They have the same amount of film on them or digital prints in probably a week that I had my entire childhood. Life has changed so much in these last 11-12 years.
Yeah, and I've really seen that in my work in a couple different areas. I think the big one, which you kind of touched on, is technology, but more specifically communication. I went from, when I started my career, really emailing teens to get in touch with them, to these days, a lot of teens do not check their email ever, and it's a lot more either text messaging or getting in touch with them through different, whatever the flavor of the month in terms of like cell phone apps is. The other thing that I think has been very interesting for me, and I think it's closely related to technology, is mental health challenges have also greatly increased. When I started my career, yes, there were some teens that I worked with that had mental health challenges, but that has really exponentially increased throughout my career.
And how are you seeing that? Are kids coming to you? Or you're just, they're posting about this? What is this?
It's really all of the above. There's been a lot of teens who come to me and talk to me about this anxiety they have at home, or issues that they're having in their own lives. I think in addition to that, especially when I worked for BBYO and denominationally based youth groups, when we have overnight conventions, there sometimes, and it's really has exponentially increased, things like suicidal ideation comes up during the event. And it's something that, like, now I strongly believe everyone who works with youth really needs to be prepared for those moments, because it happens all the time. With all the anxiety the teens are feeling in their lives.
Yeah, it's kind kind of an ironic thing that a lot of these teens, sort of the pressures that may have been on different generations are not necessarily there, but the anxiety is higher. It's not in proportion to necessarily what's happening around them, but the smartphone and the intensity and how quickly things move, and how much, the pressure that they feel seems to just be rising all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. I think it's really the combination of teens going on their Instagram or Snapchat and they see people really presenting like their best selves and not necessarily the moment that they're like not hanging out with friends or not dressed as nicely as maybe they want to, and they feel like when they have those moments that like they're outside of the norm, even though everyone is experiencing those things. And I think that really builds on their anxieties. And I also think in today's world where it's just so competitive to get into college and you're prepping for college even in elementary school, that there's intense academic pressure on teens as well.
Right. Well, I think it comes down to, the future, their future selves, that it's really unclear. They have to jump through so many different hoops. And I kind of mark it to a time right when I was applying to colleges in the early 90s, that colleges started shifting to activities, grading on how many activities that a child, that's how they were going to tell the difference between different SAT scores. And it's had this enormous effect that's really not documented in a lot of society, that, it's increased the pressure to participate in all these other events. And so the structured life becomes more and more, and the unstructured life gets smaller and smaller. And it's quite incredible. Most of the time, believe it or not, when I was growing up, not too long ago, most of my childhood was unstructured. I had very few structured activities growing up.
And that's super interesting for me because I graduated high school in 2006, and most of the activities I attended as a child were structured. I think there were very few that were unstructured. And I remember when I applied for college, it was all about creating the narrative of the activities you participated in and the progression you went through from being a member to being in a leadership position. And I know through my work with teens that process of creating a narrative about your like entire life is even more intense than it was when I was applying to school.
Yeah, one of the things I notice with raising kids is that the pressure to be part of team sports, travel sports, or intensive activities actually starts really young, like in first grade. I mean, it is crazy. And there is this unspoken or sometimes spoken understanding that if your children aren't on these advanced metrics, sort of like the old Russian system, if they don't get into these things, they won't be in high school sports or high school activities. And hence they will also, it'll affect their college education and their future. It's quite incredible that type of pressure is like kind of trickled down all the way to such a young level.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we all need to be aware of with the activities we're offering to teens and really all children to give them that chance to not be in that competitive environment.
All right, we're going to take a moment just to take a break to remind everyone what we're doing. I'm Rabbi Alex Lazarus Klein from Congregation Shir Shalom in Williamsville, New York, and I welcome you to Crossroads. Crossroads is a joint production of Town Square Media, the Network of Religious Communities. The Network of Religious Communities is an organization of denominations, congregations, and religious organizations located in and serving Western New York. We are Baha'i, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Unitarian. Together celebrate the wonderful religious diversity of Western New York. On Crossroads, we discuss the life journey and community service of our guests, and today I have with me Mike Steklof, who is the Director of Teen Engagement and Inclusion at the Center for Jewish and Engagement and Learning. Okay, so we're going to kind of get into your work. Your position is actually brand new.
It is, yes.
We're in the bit of a shift, and because I've lived here quite a while, more than a decade, I'm kind of aware of this, and you're kind of coming into this new. Most of our teen programs up until this year were based around what was called the Hebrew High, which was a cooperative agreement among all different synagogues in this area, from Orthodox to Reform or just unaffiliated. to have the teens together in one space. But as that was shrinking and our demographics, particularly among the youth, have shrunk, we've had to change gears, and that's where you come in. So in this population of teens that have all of these issues they face, what do we do? What is the answer to helping them sort through this and giving them a safety net through our Jewish community?
So I think it's really a combination of two things. I think, as we've touched on before, it's really about having great adult role models that teens can turn to and really connect with, and be that sounding board for everything that comes out through their lives. And I think the other thing is on the programmatic level, to make sure all the programs we're offering are really relevant and meaningful to their lives. And that means, instead of us just as adults planning programs from our offices, to really be out in the community and working with teens to plan programs that really mean things to them themselves.
Yeah, well, what I notice about you, and you have a double engagement, both in your title and in the center that you work with. This is kind of a confusing term. It's something our Jewish community has been processing because it's a catchword. Every generation has its little catchword, from continuity now to engagement. And it often refers to this process of going out to meet people. And that's what I notice, is that you go on a lot of coffee dates.
That's very true. I drink a lot of coffee with adults, and I eat a lot of ice cream with teens.
So it is about kind of being real and being there for people, because I think that that's part of the secret sauce, is that often they're just streamlined into whatever system and they're not really listened to as a human being.
Definitely. And I think that's so important. And I think it's making sure that everyone, both yourself and the teens you're working with, are their authentic selves. And when you have that kind of relationship, you're really able to plan great programs. And I think the other benefit to planning programs in this way is it really organically teaches teens leadership skills. And I know, even when I was a teen in Nifty, I did many things that I still do today, from planning programs through ordering food for an event to even booking conference spaces, things that I've worked with teens to do. And it's something that a lot of people don't have an opportunity to do until they're an adult, perhaps planning like a family event, but they're really important skills that everyone needs to have.
Right. It's skill building, leadership building, and you have a program that you're starting, a fellowship program.
Definitely. So for 10th and 11th graders, we're starting a Jewish Teen Leadership Fellowship. I'm actually thankful to a great volunteer by the name of Hadar, who really put the vision for this fellowship together. And what we're really doing is we're working with teens to explore their Jewish identity while teaching real leadership skills, which are so important for everyone to have.
Mm-hmm. I love this idea of a fellowship. Fellowship and cohorts are also, I noticed, very big words that go into it. I think that is actually a huge advantage. The kids today have a lot more anxiety and a lot more structure and a lot less resilience because of it. But actually, on the flip side, they have the ability to do things because they have access to the world, really, in a way I certainly didn't have growing up. We were kind of limited to what was around us. And if they put their minds to it, they can really, transform not just their lives locally, but and nationally, but even globally. I mean, we have Greta Thunberg, who came and sailed across the ocean in this remarkable journey. This is a 16-year-old. It's practically unheard of in a different world, but in this world, she can get the microphone to be able to address world leaders. It's incredible.
Definitely. It is really amazing. And I know many teens that have either started businesses or started nonprofit organizations or even advocated for really important issues as teenagers. And I think one of the big messages that will be embedded in this fellowship and is really embedded in every conversation I have with teens is you really can do whatever you want if you put your mind to it. And I think think a lot of the job of me and other adult role models is helping with the skill building piece to give the teens the skills they need to do these amazing things.
So I want to talk to you about a different topic because it seems to dominate our conversation in the religious world, particularly in the last year, which is we have a lot of issues of sexual abuse and things like that. How does that come up? How does that transform your job? And the constraints in terms of how do we build a protective society?
No, I think that's a really good point. It is something that is very evident in any work anyone does with youth. And I think a lot of it is creating those boundaries just because you never want to put yourself in a situation where you could be accused of doing something that you shouldn't be doing. So I think a lot of it is really figuring out and communicating both to teens and their parents, what are your personal policies around calling or texting teens? What are your policies around meeting a teen in a coffee shop and what that looks like? And I think a lot of it are things that many youth organizations have been doing for years, such as never being one-on-one in a private space with a teen. And a lot of it is just really making sure protecting like yourself and the teens themselves.
Mm-hmm. Is this an issue that the teens talk about, do you find?
The teens do talk about it. They don't necessarily talk about it from the level of an adult with a teen, but like there's a lot of interesting dynamics teen to teen. I know in my previous position in Cleveland, there were definitely a lot of talk among teens themselves about like their relationships with teens of other genders and what that looked like, especially as they were leading programs together. Because as I think many of us know, teenage boys and teenage girls have very different conceptions about the world, and especially in high school, sometimes that comes to a head when you're working closely with someone of the other gender to plan a program.
Right. Well, you bring up gender. I'm so glad you did, because I know you're doing a doctoral thesis on gender in synagogue life, and that's also a really important topic to teens these days.
Definitely. So I have a deep background in gender. I actually have a master's degree in gender studies, and as you alluded to, I'm at Gratz College right now writing a dissertation on how gender is transmitted in Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Jewish spaces.
Okay, so first, Gratz College. I'm very proud because I actually worked in that building and attended classes there. That's in Philadelphia, but they now have studies like so many schools that you can do more online and out of, because you're not in Philadelphia, obviously.
Definitely. It's really helpful to us working professionals who want to also learn that we can be in a doctoral program without being on site on a regular basis.
So some of the things that I've realized that I think would be helpful to talk about in the roughly 8 minutes or so we have to go is these gender language, which is really, really important to the younger generation, but hasn't necessarily filtered out completely. It's starting to, but things like what is your pronoun? Do you want to explain a little bit about what the use of pronouns and what that means for someone who hasn't been exposed to that?
Definitely. So in today's world, especially among teens, a lot of people are very concerned about what your preferred pronoun is, to the point that at many teen conferences, and even in my email signature at the bottom, it says my preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. And the whole idea is creating a space for people that are gender non-binary to recognize that you're okay if you want to impose on yourself non-gendered pronouns such as they, them, and theirs.
Okay, so gendered non-binary, that basically means that a binary male, female.
Correct.
So they don't fit into that in some way, into the standard male, female binary.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. And have you worked with students that use they as a pronoun?
I have, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for organizations, it's really important for us to think about things such as if there's someone who's either gender non-binary or someone who does not identify with their biological sex, what does that look like in terms of sleeping arrangements even at an overnight event?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that might be helpful for those of you that aren't familiar with the pronoun language and why the focus is that I learned from Dr. Andrea Jacobs, who's out of Temple University in Philadelphia, who spoke about how, think about it, a triangle of different roles. You have your gender, which is how you think about your sexual orientation kind of in your head. You have your sexual identity, what's below the waist kind of. And then you also have attraction, and that all three of those categories can be different. They can all be aligned or they cannot be. But the gendered part is the one part where you can just get out of the way right away. And as opposed to entering into a situation where you address someone as a he who feels closer to she or to they, and create problems in that way.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very good point, because gender and biological sex can be two very different things, and especially for teens who are exploring their identity, the gender can change throughout one's life if depending on how one identifies with themselves.
Mm-hmm. One thing that you hear also is gender queer, which kind of not feeling comfortable in the binary. You also will hear language like cisgender, which is intended as the opposite of this non-binary.
Yes, I actually really like the cisgender language, because when I was a student, that language had not entered into the vocabulary yet. So there was this idea of normative and non-normative, which, at least in my opinion, is not really the proper language. And so cisgender and transgender, I think, is closer to correct language, getting away from the normative idea.
So it's funny, I came back from a conference last November, the first conference that I had been exposed to what pronouns were, and I came to a local senior housing place, Amberley, and I asked the residents there if they'd like to learn it, and they were really, really curious about it. Because they wanted to know it for their grandchildren, how to be able to address them. As a teen today, if someone doesn't have that on below their email, is that a sign that they're not kind of in the in crowd?
I think it's not necessarily about being in or out, but I think it goes back to even why on my laptop I have the equal sign of the HRC, like the sticker on the back of my laptop. It's just a sign to teens and really to everyone that you're open to conversations about LGBT plus issues and concerns.
And language is so important, because how we speak is how we think, and then how we act. And so it's really, really hard. I noticed in my children's camp, there was a child who moved into the they program. And it was the first time that I'd encountered that. And it was really difficult to change the language. But once you make the shift, then all possibilities are open.
Definitely. I think it's also really important to note that all of us are humans and we make mistakes. And I think the most important thing with everything and with preferred pronouns is to make the effort. And yes, if you make a mistake, what I've been told by some people who identify with they, them, and theirs, that it's the equivalent of calling someone by the wrong name, which I think we've all had experiences doing. So I think it's important to make the effort and then apologize gracefully if you make a mistake.
Mm-hmm. So we're nearing the end of our time. What other issues do you see being really important to teens today that we didn't bring up already?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think we've really covered most of them, but I think the thing that a lot of teens would say if you ask them is a lot of teens really want to be treated as adults and be given responsibilities. And I know that's sometimes hard for all of us, but I think it goes back to like my philosophy around working with teens, really giving them the opportunities to learn and to grow and do all the things that they will do in their adult and professional lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, I hope that you have a long career here, and given that you're now in Buffalo and you lived in Cleveland area and Louisville and Rochester, are you a Bills fan yet?
I am. It's actually really funny because growing up, I was a Bills fan and my brother was a Dolphins fan. And so we'd go to the Bills-Dolphins game and he would wear his Dolphins gear, and you can imagine what happened to him. So he's now become a Bills fan, and I've always been a Bills fan.
It'll be interesting. Yeah, I forgot, of course, a lot of people in Rochester root for the Bills. In Toronto, we have a kind of a wide area because those other places don't have football teams. But it'll be interesting to see the dynamic for you as you get more accustomed to Buffalo, and then you go back to Rochester, and then you'll be a Buffalonian, and then your parents will be Rochester.
Definitely.
So again, we're in this high holiday period, and so we wish everyone a Shana Tova. That means a happy new year, a sweet happy new year. And also because we're in this Feast of Booths where we put up special housing called Sukkot, we wish everyone a Chag Sameach. So wonderful to have you with me.